Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation. Blake Morrison had always been a man who believed in absolutes. In his 42 years, he'd built an empire from nothing, starting with a single construction crew and growing it into Morrison Development, one of the most feared names in commercial real estate across the Midwest. His reputation wasn't built on charm or politics, but on an unwavering principle. Cross Blake Morrison once, and you'd never get the chance to do it again. The scars on his knuckles told stories his business associates would never hear. Growing up in the industrial districts of Detroit, Blake had learned early that respect was earned through strength, not words. His father, a steelworker who drank away his paycheck, had taught him that lesson with his fists. His mother had taught him another, that sometimes the people closest to you were the ones who hurt you most. Blake's corner office overlooked the Chicago skyline, a testament to how far he'd climbed from those grimy streets. The mahogany desk, imported from Brazil, held architectural plans for his latest project, a luxury hotel chain that would cement his legacy. But today, none of that mattered. Today, his 11-year-old daughter Lily lay in Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and the world as he knew it was about to shatter. His wife Claire had always been the perfect complement to his ambition. Beautiful, sophisticated, from a wealthy Highland Park family that had opened doors Blake could never have entered alone. They'd met at a charity gala 8 years ago, when Blake was still building his reputation and Claire was finishing her master's degree in art history. She'd been drawn to his intensity, his hunger for success. He'd been captivated by her elegance, her ability to navigate social circles that still viewed him as an outsider. Their marriage had been a strategic alliance as much as a love story. Claire brought connections, culture, and credibility to Blake's growing business. He provided security, excitement, and a lifestyle her trust fund couldn't maintain alone. For 7 years, it had worked perfectly. Claire played the devoted wife at business dinners, decorated their Lake Forest mansion with museum-quality pieces, and gave him Lily, the one pure thing in his often brutal world. Lily had inherited her mother's delicate features and her father's steel-gray eyes. She was precocious, intelligent, and completely unaware of the darkness that lived behind her father's controlled exterior. Blake would move mountains for that little girl, and everyone who knew him understood that harming Lily Morrison was signing their own death warrant. But someone had been foolish enough to test that boundary. The call had come at 2:47 p.m. while Blake was reviewing contracts. Claire's voice, usually so composed, was fractured with panic. "Blake, you need to get to Northwestern immediately. Lily collapsed at school. They think she's been poisoned." The drive to the hospital was a blur of Chicago traffic and grinding teeth. Blake's mind raced through possibilities, cataloging enemies, weighing threats. In his line of work, he'd made plenty of adversaries. Developers he'd outbid, contractors he'd blacklisted, city officials who'd learned the hard way that Blake Morrison didn't pay bribes. He simply found other ways to get what he wanted. But none of them would dare target Lily. They knew better. Claire was waiting in the emergency room, her usually perfect makeup streaked with tears. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way Blake hadn't seen since their early days together. "The doctors are running tests," she said, gripping his arm. "They found traces of something in her system." Blake, who would do this to a child? Dr. Paul Morrison, Blake's younger brother and one of the few people he trusted completely, emerged from the treatment area with a grim expression. Paul had followed a different path, channeling the Morrison intensity into medicine rather than business. Where Blake built things, Paul saved lives. Where Blake inspired fear, Paul inspired trust. But they shared the same uncompromising core, the same inability to let slights go unpunished. "We need to talk," Paul said, his voice carefully controlled. Privately, they found an empty consultation room, and Paul closed the door with deliberate care. The brothers stood face to face, Blake in his $5,000 suit, Paul in scrubs stained with the evidence of a long shift. But in that moment, they were just two kids from Detroit who'd learned that family was the only thing that mattered. The blood work came back. Paul began, his jaw tight. "Lily has been systematically poisoned with heavy metals, lead and mercury specifically. This is an accidental exposure, Blake. Someone has been dosing her regularly, probably for weeks." Blake felt something cold and final settle in his chest. How? Most likely through food or drink. Small doses, carefully calculated to cause gradually worsening symptoms without triggering immediate suspicion. Whoever did this has medical knowledge. They knew exactly how much to give her to cause organ damage without killing her outright. Will she? She'll recover, but there could be lasting effects. Cognitive issues, kidney problems. We won't know the full extent for months. Paul's voice dropped to a whisper. Blake, there's something else. Something I didn't want to say in front of Claire. Blake's gray eyes went flat, the same expression that had made grown men step back from negotiating tables. What? The timing of the doses, the progression of symptoms. I think whoever did this was building up to something bigger. This feels like a test run, Blake. Like they were perfecting the dosage for a fatal dose. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of implications neither wanted to voice. Finally, Blake spoke, his words carved from ice. Where is Lily now? Stable, sleeping. The immediate danger has passed, but Blake. Paul grabbed his brother's arm. I have to ask, who has regular access to her food? Who could have been doing this without raising suspicion? Blake's mind was already working, sorting through possibilities with the methodical precision that had made him wealthy. Lily's school provided lunch, but she often brought food from home. Claire packed her breakfast every morning, prepared her snacks, supervised her dinner. The housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, sometimes helped with meal preparation, but she'd been with them for 3 years and treated Lily like her own granddaughter. I need to see my daughter, Blake said. They walked back through the hospital corridors, Blake's mind spinning scenarios like a computer processing data. Someone had tried to hurt Lily. Someone with access, with knowledge, with the patience to commit a slow murder. Someone who thought they could target Blake Morrison's family and walk away. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Lily looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. Fur lines snaked into her thin arms, and monitors beeped steadily, measuring a life that someone had tried to steal. Claire sat beside the bed, holding their daughter's hand and whispering soft reassurances. Blake stood in the doorway, watching the two most important people in his world, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. The business deals, the properties, the empire he'd built. None of it mattered compared to the child breathing slowly in that bed. And someone had tried to take her from him. Sir. A nurse appeared at his elbow. Are you Mr. Morrison? There's a Detective Rodriguez here to see you about your daughter's case. Blake nodded and followed the nurse to another consultation room, where a tired-looking woman in her 40s waited with a notepad and a badge. Detective Carmen Rodriguez, no relation to their housekeeper, had the weathered appearance of someone who'd seen too much of human nature's dark side. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be handling your daughter's case. I need to ask you some questions about who might have had access to her food and drinks. For the next hour, Blake methodically walked through Lily's routine, providing names, schedules, and access points with the precision of a military briefing. Detective Rodriguez took notes, occasionally asking for clarification, but Blake could see in her eyes that she was thinking the same thing he was. This was an inside job. As the interview concluded, Blake's phone buzzed with a text message. Claire, from Lily's room. She's awake. Asking for you. Blake excused himself and walked back to his daughter's bedside. Lily's eyes opened as he approached, and she managed a weak smile that nearly broke his heart. Daddy, she whispered. I don't feel very good. I know, sweetheart. But you're going to be fine. The doctors are taking good care of you. Can I go home soon? Blake smoothed her hair, his hand trembling slightly. Soon, baby. Very soon. But as he looked at his daughter's pale face, Blake Morrison made a silent promise. Whoever had done this would pay, not through lawyers or police or the clean justice of courtrooms. They would pay in blood and terror and the kind of suffering that left scars on souls. Because Blake Morrison never forgave. And he never forgot. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. The next 3 days passed in a haze of hospital visits, police interviews, and the careful choreography of a family in crisis. Blake took leave from his company for the first time in years, posting security at Lily's room and sleeping in an uncomfortable chair that left his back aching and his temper razor-sharp. Claire seemed to be handling the stress better than expected. She'd organized a schedule of friends to visit Lily, coordinated with the school to arrange for homework to be sent home, and maintained the kind of calm efficiency that had made her such an asset during business entertaining. But Blake noticed small things. The way she avoided direct eye contact during conversations with the detective, How she seemed to know exactly which foods and drinks to bring when others asked, the careful way she phrased her answers about Lily's routine. It was Dr. Paul who first voiced what Blake was beginning to suspect. "Have you noticed anything strange about Claire's behavior?" Paul asked during one of their private conversations in the hospital cafeteria. He stirred his coffee absently, his surgical hands steady despite the exhaustion obvious in his face. Blake had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like swallowing broken glass. "What do you mean? The timeline doesn't add up, Blake. Lily's been sick for weeks, tired, nauseous, headaches." Claire's mentioned specific symptoms to the doctors that suggest she's been tracking this progression carefully. Almost like she knew what to expect. "I don't want to believe it either, but we have to consider all possibilities. Claire has access, she has the means, and—" Paul hesitated, then pushed forward. "Blake, when was the last time you really looked at your marriage? I mean, really looked at it?" Blake's jaw tightened. His marriage to Claire had always been more partnership than passion, but it worked. They operated in different spheres. He handled business and security. She managed social connections and domestic arrangements. They'd been successful together, built something substantial. But now that Paul had planted the seed of doubt, Blake found himself remembering small inconsistencies he'd previously ignored. The late-night phone calls Claire claimed were from her book club. The way she'd started working out at a new gym across town instead of the closer facility they'd both used. Her sudden interest in learning about nutrition and vitamins, which she'd explained as wanting to improve Lily's health. The expensive lingerie he'd found in her dresser that she'd never worn for him. "I need proof," Blake said finally. "What kind of proof are you looking for?" Blake's smile was cold enough to frost windows. The kind that ends careers and destroys lives. That evening, Blake returned to their Lake Forest home for the first time since Lily's hospitalization. The Georgian colonial sat on 2 manicured acres, every detail perfect down to the seasonal flower arrangements Claire refreshed monthly. It was a monument to their success, and now it felt like a crime scene. Mrs. Rodriguez met him at the door, her weathered face creased with worry. "Mr. Blake, how is our little angel?" "She's going to be fine, Maria. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." They sat in the kitchen where Maria had prepared countless meals for his family. Blake had always appreciated her straightforward manner. She was one of the few people who didn't seem intimidated by his reputation. "Have you noticed anything unusual about Mrs. Morrison's behavior lately? Changes in routine, new habits?" Maria's hands twisted in her apron. I don't like to speak badly of Mrs. Morrison. She is good to me, gives me raises, never complains about my work." "Maria, someone poisoned Lily. Someone with access to her food. I need to know if you've seen anything that might help me find out who." The older woman's face went pale. "Dios mío. Poisoned. Our baby was poisoned. The doctors confirmed it. Now please, think carefully. Anything at all." Maria was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. Finally, she looked up with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Morrison, she started making Lily's breakfast herself every morning about 2 months ago. Said she wanted to spend more time with her, be more involved. Before that, Lily usually ate cereal or toast." "What kind of breakfast?" "Special smoothies. With vitamins and supplements." Mrs. Morrison said they would make Lily strong and smart. She kept all the ingredients in a locked cabinet in the pantry. Said they were expensive and she didn't want them to be wasted. Blake felt his blood turn to ice water. "Show me." The locked cabinet was small and mounted high on the pantry wall. Blake had never paid attention to it before. Claire had always handled household management. Maria pointed to it with a shaking finger. "She has the only key. Keeps it on her keychain always." Blake studied the lock. It was a simple tumbler mechanism, the kind he'd learned to pick during his misspent youth in Detroit. Within 30 seconds, he had it open. Inside were bottles of supplements, protein powders, and exotic superfood additives. All legitimate products, all carefully arranged. But tucked behind a container of spirulina powder, Blake found something that made his vision narrow to a red tunnel. A small glass vial with no label, containing a clear liquid. Next to it, a precise digital scale and a set of tiny measuring spoons. Blake carefully photographed everything with his phone before closing the cabinet and relocking it. Then he called Paul. "I found something. Can you analyze a liquid sample if I bring it to you?" "Blake, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, can you do it or not?" Paul's voice was grim. Bring it to the lab. But Blake, be very careful how you handle this. If Claire is involved, confronting her directly could be dangerous. Don't worry about me, little brother. I've been handling dangerous people my entire life. But as Blake climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, he realized this was different. This wasn't a business rival or a corrupt official. This was his wife. The woman who'd shared his bed for 7 years, who'd given birth to his daughter, who knew his routines and vulnerabilities better than anyone alive. If Claire was trying to kill Lily, there was only one reason that made sense. She was clearing the way for someone else's future. Someone who didn't want Blake Morrison's daughter to inherit what he'd built. Blake sat on the edge of the bed he'd shared with Claire and opened his laptop. If his wife was betraying him, she wasn't doing it alone. And Blake Morrison had resources that went far beyond what most people could imagine. Within an hour, he'd hired 3 different private investigation firms, each tasked with surveilling different aspects of Claire's life without knowledge of the others. Her phone records, her financial accounts, her daily movements, everything would be monitored and documented. He also activated a security system he'd installed but never told Claire about, one that recorded audio and video in every room of the house. By the time Claire returned from the hospital that evening, Blake was waiting in his study with a glass of bourbon and a carefully neutral expression. "How's Lily?" he asked. "Better. Paul thinks she might be able to come home tomorrow." Claire settled into the chair across from his desk, looking elegant and composed despite the stress of the past few days. "I was thinking we should hire a full-time nurse for the first week, just to be safe." "Good idea. Did Detective Rodriguez have any updates?" "Nothing significant. She's still interviewing people who had access to Lily's food." Claire's voice was steady, but Blake noticed she was fidgeting with her wedding ring. "Blake, do you think we should consider a security upgrade? If someone was really trying to hurt Lily." "Already taken care of. I'm having the system completely overhauled." It wasn't a lie exactly. Blake was upgrading the security, just not in the way Claire expected. They talked for another hour about arrangements for Lily's recovery, about work schedules and medical appointments. Normal domestic conversation between worried parents. But underneath the surface, Blake was watching his wife with the same predatory focus he'd once used to hunt down business competitors. And Claire Morrison, the woman he'd trusted with his heart and his daughter's life, was beginning to look very much like prey. That night, as Claire slept beside him, Blake stared at the ceiling and planned his next moves with the methodical precision of a general preparing for war. If his wife was betraying him, she would discover that Blake Morrison's reputation for ruthlessness hadn't been exaggerated. It had been understated. Chapter 3. The Web Revealed. The forensic analysis of the vial took Paul 48 hours and several favors with lab technicians who owed him from medical school. When he called Blake with the results, his voice was flat and professional in the way it got when he was delivering devastating news to patients' families. "It's a compound solution, mercury chloride and lead acetate, buffered to delay absorption. Someone with advanced chemistry knowledge created this, Blake. This isn't something you could look up on the internet." Blake sat in his car outside a downtown construction site, watching workers pour concrete for the foundation of what would become Chicago's newest luxury shopping complex. The metaphor wasn't lost on him. Foundations could be solid or they could crumble, depending on what went into them from the beginning. How long would it take to kill someone? Administered in the doses I'm calculating based on Lily's blood work? 4 to 6 months for an adult, maybe half that for a child. But Blake. Paul's voice dropped. "There's something else. I ran the compound through our toxicology database. This exact formulation has shown up before." "Where?" 3 cases in the past 2 years. All ruled natural deaths initially. Kidney failure, heart problems, neurological decline. All were wealthy individuals with substantial inheritances. The families requested private autopsies when they became suspicious, and that's when we found the poisoning. Blake felt his world tilt slightly. "You're telling me this is a pattern?" "I'm telling you someone is running a very sophisticated operation. And your wife might not be the mastermind. She might just be the latest recruit." The implications hit Blake like a physical blow. Claire wasn't just betraying him. She was part of something larger, more calculated. Someone had targeted his family specifically, studied their routines, identified vulnerabilities, and then turned his own wife into a weapon. "I need names, Paul." "The other victims." "Blake, this is police business now. If there's an organized conspiracy." The police moved slowly and talked too much. By the time they build a case, Claire could disappear or Lily could have another accident. I move faster and I talk to people in ways that get immediate answers. Paul was quiet for a moment. Blake could practically hear his brother's internal debate, doctor's oath versus family loyalty. Family won, as Blake had known it would. I'll email you the files. But Blake, promise me you won't do anything that can't be undone. Blake's laugh was sharp as broken glass. I haven't done anything I couldn't live with yet, little brother. I'm not planning to start now. The 3 previous victims painted a picture that made Blake's blood run cold. Margaret Whitfield, 73, widow of a pharmaceutical company founder, poisoned over 6 months, died of apparent kidney failure. Her estate worth $42 million had been inherited by her nephew's wife, who'd been caring for her during her illness. David Chun, 58, tech entrepreneur with no children, poisoned over 4 months, died of apparent neurological decline. His estate worth $18 million had been inherited by his much younger second wife, who'd convinced him to change his will just months before his death. Robert Vasquez, 61, real estate developer with a complicated family situation, poisoned over 5 months, died of apparent heart problems. His estate worth $31 million had been inherited by his estranged daughter, who'd reconciled with him during his final year and convinced him to cut his other children out of his will. The pattern was clear: wealthy targets, complicated family dynamics, and beneficiaries who'd had intimate access during the poisoning period. But more disturbing was what Blake found when he dug deeper into the connection between the beneficiaries. Margaret Whitfield's nephew's wife, Elena Santos, had worked as a pharmaceutical research assistant before her marriage. David Chin's second wife, Ashley Kim, had a master's degree in biochemistry. Robert Vasquez's daughter, Carmen Vasquez Miller, had completed medical school but never practiced. All 3 women had the knowledge to create sophisticated poisons. All 3 had gained access to wealthy men through family connections or marriage. And all 3 had received their inheritances within the past 18 months. But the connection that made Blake's hands shake with rage was what he found in Claire's credit card records. For the past year, Claire had been making monthly payments to something called Meridian Wellness Consulting. The address traced to a luxury office building in downtown Chicago, but when Blake drove past, the suite was empty except for a forwarding address in the Cayman Islands. Elena Santos, Ashley Kim, and Carmen Vasquez Miller had all made payments to the same company. Blake Morrison had spent 20 years building an empire through careful planning, strategic thinking, and the ability to see 3 moves ahead of his opponents. Now he was facing an adversary who'd played the same game, except they'd made one critical error. They'd targeted his daughter. That evening, Blake returned to the hospital with a teddy bear for Lily and a carefully rehearsed performance for his wife. He kissed Claire's cheek, asked about discharge procedures, and discussed their plans for Lily's recovery with the concerned devotion of a loving husband. But his phone was recording every word, and the private investigators he'd hired were already in position to document Claire's every move once they left the hospital. "I was thinking," Blake said as they prepared to take Lily home, "maybe we should plan a family vacation once she's fully recovered. Somewhere tropical, maybe the Caribbean." Claire's face lit up with what looked like genuine pleasure. "That sounds wonderful. Lily would love that. I'll have my travel agent look into some options. Maybe somewhere private, where we can really relax without any interruptions." As Blake loaded Lily's get-well gifts into the car, he was already planning a very different kind of trip. The Cayman Islands were known for their banking privacy and their beautiful beaches. They were also known for being places where wealthy people could disappear without a trace. But Blake Morrison wasn't planning to disappear. He was planning to make other people vanish, along with every trace of the organization that had dared to target his family. The drive home was filled with Lily's excited chatter about returning to her own room, her own toys, her own life. Blake watched his daughter in the rearview mirror, noting the color returning to her cheeks, the energy in her voice. She was going to be fine. She was going to live and grow up and inherit everything he'd built. But first, Blake was going to destroy everyone who tried to take that future away from her. As they pulled into their driveway, Blake's phone buzzed with a text from one of his investigators. "Target made contact. Have photos and audio. When do you want the full report?" Blake typed back, "Tonight. All of it." Claire was chattering about getting Lily settled back into her routine, about gradually reintroducing normal foods, about the follow-up appointments with Paul. She sounded like a devoted mother, concerned only with her daughter's welfare. She was a very good actress. But Blake Morrison had been performing his whole life, and he was better. Chapter 4. The hunt begins. The surveillance photos were spread across Blake's desk like evidence of a war crime. His wife of 7 years, the woman who'd kissed him goodbye that morning and promised to pick up Lily's prescription, was locked in an embrace with a man Blake didn't recognize outside a downtown hotel. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m. Lily's prescription had been picked up at 4:15 p.m., according to the pharmacy receipt Claire had shown him, which meant his wife had gone from her lover's arms to collecting medicine for the daughter she'd been systematically poisoning. Blake studied the photographs with the same cold focus he'd once used to analyze property surveys and construction blueprints. The man was tall, well-dressed, probably in his late 30s. Handsome in the polished way that suggested money and education. He wore a Rolex and drove a BMW with Illinois plates that traced back to a rental company. His name, according to the investigator's report, was Troy Matheson, resident of Miami, Florida. Occupation listed as investment consultant with an office address that traced to a shell corporation. No criminal record, but a pattern of relationships with wealthy women that ended when their husbands died or divorced them. Blake's phone rang. Detective Rodriguez. Mr. Morrison, I wanted to update you on your daughter's case. We've been looking into the source of the poisoning, and I need to ask you some additional questions about your household routine. Of course. What do you need to know? We've identified the likely delivery method, contaminated food or beverages consumed regularly over an extended period. Can you think of anything Lily ate or drank daily that she wouldn't share with other family members? Blake felt the trap closing around his wife with the satisfying inevitability of a perfectly timed demolition. Her morning smoothie. Claire started making special vitamin smoothies for Lily about 2 months ago. Said they would boost her immune system. The silence on the other end stretched for 10 seconds. Mr. Morrison, we're going to need to examine those ingredients. All of them. Of course. I'll have everything ready for you. After hanging up, Blake called his corporate attorney. Richard, I need you to prepare some documents. Quietly and quickly. Richard Hawthorne had been handling Blake's legal affairs for 15 years, ever since Blake had pulled him out of a mid-tier firm and offered him twice his salary to work exclusively for Morrison Development. He was discreet, efficient, and had never asked uncomfortable questions about Blake's business methods. What kind of documents? Divorce papers. I want everything. Full custody of Lily, complete financial protection, and a clause that prevents Claire from contesting any of it. Also, I need you to research something called Meridian Wellness Consulting and any connections to a Troy Matheson from Miami. Blake, what's going on? War, Richard. And I intend to win. Blake's next call was to Marcus Webb, a private security contractor who'd handled sensitive situations for Morrison Development when conventional solutions weren't sufficient. Marcus had spent 12 years in military special operations before going private, and he understood that some problems required permanent solutions. I need surveillance on 2 targets, Blake said. Full package, communications, movements, associates, financial activity. And Marcus? I need to know if they're planning to leave the country. How urgent? Yesterday. Blake spent the next hour reviewing the financial records his investigators had compiled. Claire's secret credit card showed payments not just to Meridian Wellness Consulting, but to a dozen other companies that traced back to the same Cayman Islands address. Travel bookings, hotel reservations, cash advances. His wife had been planning something for months. But the most damning evidence was what he found in her browser history, extracted from the home computer she thought was private. Searches for untraceable poisons, inheritance law, life insurance payouts for accidental death, and countries without extradition treaties. Claire Morrison wasn't just having an affair. She was planning to murder her family. That evening, Blake sat in his study and called Paul. The police are going to find the poison in our house tomorrow. Claire's going to be arrested. Good. Justice system works. She goes to prison. Lily stays safe. No. Blake's voice was soft and deadly. The justice system is slow and uncertain. Claire has resources, connections, expensive lawyers. She might beat the charges, claim someone else planted evidence, argue that she was manipulated by her boyfriend. Even if she's convicted, she could be out in 10 years with good behavior. Blake, what are you thinking? I'm thinking that Claire and her boyfriend made one critical error. They thought Blake Morrison was just another wealthy mark, another victim to be manipulated and destroyed. They didn't research their target carefully enough. Paul's voice was tight with concern. What does that mean? Blake smiled, and if Paul could have seen it, he would have called in a psychiatric evaluation. It means they don't know that before I was a successful businessman, I was a very dangerous young man who learned to solve problems permanently. It means they're about to discover that some people can't be victimized, only temporarily inconvenienced. Blake, don't do anything that can't be undone. Everything can be undone, Paul. The question is whether anyone will be left alive to undo it. Blake hung up and opened his laptop. Troy Matheson's financial records, obtained through methods that Richard Hawthorne never needed to know about, painted the picture of a man who'd made a career out of seducing wealthy women and arranging convenient deaths. In the past 5 years, Troy had been romantically linked to 6 women whose husbands had died suddenly. 2 heart attacks, 1 car accident, 1 drowning, 1 fall from a balcony, and 1 apparent suicide. All ruled accidental or natural, all resulting in substantial inheritances for the grieving widows. Troy Matheson was a professional killer, and Claire was his latest recruit. But Blake Morrison was about to teach them both that some prey fight back. The next morning, Blake kissed his wife goodbye and told her he loved her. He hugged Lily, who was already looking healthier after just 2 days away from her mother's poisoned smoothies. He went to his office and conducted 3 business meetings with his usual efficiency. And at 2:30 p.m., he watched from his office window as police cars surrounded the house where his wife was preparing lunch for the daughter she'd been trying to murder. By evening, Claire Morrison was in custody, charged with attempted murder, child endangerment, and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. The poison in the locked cabinet, the digital scale, the financial records showing payments to a known criminal organization. But Blake Morrison was just getting started. Because Claire and Troy had made the mistake of thinking that arresting the conspirators would end the story. They'd forgotten that Blake Morrison had built his reputation on being the kind of man who finished what others started. And he always finished it his way. Chapter 5, The Net Titans. Claire's arraignment was a media circus. The story had everything Chicago reporters loved: wealthy suburban family, poisoned child, cheating wife, mysterious boyfriend. Blake sat in the front row of the courtroom, wearing his most expensive suit and an expression of devastated betrayal that played perfectly for the cameras. The judge set bail at $2 million. Blake could have paid it without blinking, but he sat motionless as Claire's attorney argued for a reduction. Let her stay in Cook County Jail for a few more days. Let her understand what helplessness felt like. After the hearing, Blake met with Detective Rodriguez in the courthouse cafeteria. "We've got solid evidence for the attempted murder charge," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "But the federal task force is interested in the larger conspiracy. These Meridian Wellness consulting payments suggest your wife was part of something bigger. What do you need from me? Cooperation. If Claire tries to make a deal by giving up her associates, we want to make sure we can verify her information." Blake nodded gravely. "Whatever you need to protect other families from going through this." What he didn't tell Detective Rodriguez was that he'd already located Meridian Wellness Consulting's real headquarters. Not the Cayman Islands postal box, but a luxury office building in downtown Miami where Troy Matheson maintained a suite under his real name. Dr. Troy Matheson, former biochemistry professor at the University of Miami who'd been quietly dismissed 3 years ago for conducting unauthorized research on untraceable toxins. Blake's team in Miami had been watching the building for 48 hours. Troy was still there, apparently confident that his operation was secure. He met daily with 2 other individuals, Elena Santos and Carmen Vasquez-Miller, the beneficiaries from the previous poisoning cases. They were running a consulting business that helped wealthy women eliminate inconvenient husbands and children. But they'd made a crucial error by targeting Blake Morrison's family. That evening, Blake visited Lily at her grandmother's house in Highland Park. Claire's mother, Patricia Whitmore, was a steel-haired society matron who'd never quite approved of her daughter's marriage to someone with Blake's background. But she'd always doted on Lily, and Blake knew his daughter would be safe there while he handled the situation with her mother. "Grandma Pat is teaching me to play bridge," Lily announced over dinner. "She says I'm very smart and could be good at it." "You're smart enough to be good at anything," Blake said, kissing her forehead. His daughter was recovering quickly from the poisoning, her natural resilience overcoming what her mother had tried to do to her. Are you okay staying here for a few more days while I take care of some business? Is mommy really sick? Blake had told Lily that her mother was in the hospital, getting help for an illness that made her do things she didn't mean to do. It was close enough to the truth. Yes, baby, but she's getting better. Will she come home soon? Blake looked into his daughter's trusting gray eyes and made another silent promise. Lily would never have to worry about her mother hurting her again. We'll see, sweetheart. The important thing is that you're safe and healthy. After tucking Lily into bed, Blake met with Patricia Whitmore in her study. She poured him a glass of 30-year-old scotch and settled into the leather chair across from his. I assume you want custody, she said without preamble. Permanent, full, and uncontested. Patricia nodded. Claire was always weak. Too easily influenced, too quick to take shortcuts. I'd hoped marriage to someone like you would give her structure. Someone like me? Someone with spine. Someone who understands that actions have consequences. Patricia sipped her scotch thoughtfully. I've already called my attorney. We'll support your custody petition. Lily needs stability, not a mother who. She gestured vaguely toward the door, unable to voice what Claire had done. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just make sure Claire pays for what she did to that child. Blake's smile was thin and sharp. Oh, she will. They all will. The next morning, Blake flew to Miami on his private jet. He'd told his staff he was meeting with potential investors for a South Florida development project. It wasn't entirely a lie. He was planning to make some significant investments in Miami area real estate. Specifically, a remote property where certain business problems could be resolved permanently and quietly. Marcus Webb met him at the airport with surveillance photos and detailed intelligence reports. Target maintains a regular schedule, Marcus said as they drove toward downtown Miami. Office during business hours, gym in the evening, home to a penthouse apartment on Brickell Avenue. He's got security cameras, but no personal protection. Confident, maybe overconfident. What about the women? Elena Santos lives in Coral Gables, expensive neighborhood, but not gated. Carmen Vasquez Miller has a condo in South Beach. Both maintain low profiles, minimal social media presence. They're careful, but not paranoid. Blake studied the photos of Troy Matheson's building. Modern glass and steel, the kind of place where young professionals made their fortunes through legitimate business. The perfect cover for a murder consulting operation. I want to talk to him, Blake said. That's not advisable. If he's connected to organized crime. He's not connected to organized crime. He's running a boutique operation that targets wealthy families. Very selective, very careful, very smart. But he's not prepared for someone who fights back. Marcus was quiet for a moment. What kind of conversation are we talking about? Blake's expression was calm, businesslike. The kind where he explains exactly how many families he's destroyed and helps me contact the other victims' relatives. And then the kind where he apologizes for what he did to my daughter. And after the apology? After the apology, Troy Matheson disappears, along with his business partners and anyone else who knew about their little consulting firm. Marcus nodded slowly. In 15 years of working with Blake Morrison, he'd learned not to question the man's methods. Blake paid extremely well, never asked his people to take risks he wouldn't take himself, and had never left anyone hanging when situations went sideways. And Marcus had seen what happened to people who crossed Blake Morrison. They tended to experience sudden reversals of fortune that left them broken, bankrupt, and occasionally missing. I'll need 12 hours to set up, Marcus said. You have 6. Blake spent the afternoon walking through Miami's financial district, getting a feel for the territory. He'd built his Chicago empire by understanding every neighborhood, every building, every potential advantage or vulnerability. Miami was different, newer money, looser regulations, more willing to overlook irregularities in exchange for investment capital. It was exactly the kind of place where someone like Troy Matheson could operate comfortably for years without attracting attention. But comfort bred complacency, and complacency was a weakness Blake Morrison had never allowed himself. That evening, as Troy Matheson left his gym and walked toward his BMW, he found Blake Morrison leaning against the driver's side door. Dr. Matheson, Blake said pleasantly, I believe you know my wife. Troy was handsome in person, with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of successfully manipulating people. But Blake saw the momentary flicker of fear in his eyes before the practiced smile took over. I'm sorry, do we know each other? Blake Morrison, Claire's husband. father of the 11-year-old girl you've been helping my wife poison." The smile disappeared completely. Troy's hand moved toward his pocket, but stopped when he noticed Marcus Webb standing 10 feet away with the unmistakable posture of professional security. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Blake said softly. "You seduced my wife, taught her to poison my daughter, and planned to help her inherit my estate after arranging my death. The only thing I'm unclear about is whether you're going to die quickly or slowly." Troy's face went pale under his expensive tan. "Look, whatever you think you know. I know everything, Troy." Meridian Wellness Consulting. Elena Santos. Carmen Vasquez Miller. Margaret Whitfield. David Chun. Robert Vasquez. "I know about all of them." The parking garage was empty except for Blake's rental car and Marcus's surveillance van. Troy looked around desperately, probably calculating distances to exits, wondering if anyone would hear him scream. "What do you want?" Troy asked finally. Blake's smile was colder than a Chicago winter. "I want you to tell me everything. Every victim, every partner, every detail of your little murder consulting business. And then I want you to help me arrange a meeting with your business partners." "And if I refuse?" Blake nodded to Marcus, who opened the van's rear doors. Inside was a collection of tools that Troy immediately recognized from his own research into untraceable killing methods. "Then we'll have our conversation someplace more private," Blake said. "And it will take much longer." Troy Matheson had spent 3 years arranging the deaths of wealthy men who'd never seen the threat coming. But as he looked into Blake Morrison's gray eyes, he realized he'd finally met someone who was better at violence than he was. "Okay," Troy whispered. "Okay, I'll tell you everything." Blake's smile widened slightly. "I was hoping you'd say that." Chapter 6. The Reckoning. The warehouse Blake had rented sat on 20 acres of industrial wasteland south of Miami, the kind of place where ambitious developers talked about future retail complexes but never quite found the financing. Blake had paid cash for a 6-month lease and told the owner he was storing construction equipment for a potential project. The construction equipment turned out to be Troy Matheson, zip-tied to a chair in the center of the empty space, while Blake Morrison sat across from him at a folding table with a digital recorder and a manila folder thick with evidence. "Let's start with the basics," Blake said conversationally. "How many people have you killed?" Troy's confession had taken 6 hours. Blake was a patient interrogator, methodical and thorough, asking the same questions from different angles until he was satisfied he had the complete truth. Marcus Webb stood guard near the entrance, occasionally checking his phone for updates from the surveillance teams watching Elena Santos and Carmen Vasquez Miller. The scope of Troy's operation was impressive in its brutality. 17 murders over 4 years, each carefully staged to look natural or accidental. The victims were always wealthy men with complicated family situations, identified through social media research and dating websites where lonely widows and unhappy wives advertised their availability. Troy's method was elegant in its simplicity. He would seduce the mark's wife or daughter, gradually gaining their confidence while providing emotional support for their difficult family situation. Then he would introduce the concept of liberation through carefully designed accidents or illnesses. The women provided access and alibis. Troy provided the technical expertise and the poison. The payoff was always split 3 ways. 1/3 to the widow or daughter who'd inherited the estate, 1/3 to Troy, and 1/3 to Elena and Carmen, who recruited new targets and provided logistical support. 17 families, Blake said softly. 17 men who trusted the wrong women. It wasn't personal, Troy said for the 5th time, his voice hoarse from hours of talking. They were just business opportunities. My daughter was 11 years old. Claire said you were planning to cut her out of your will. She said you'd threatened to divorce her and leave her with nothing. She was desperate. Blake's laugh was harsh as grinding glass. I never threatened to divorce Claire. And Lily was always going to inherit everything. Claire knew that. Troy's face went white as the implications sank in. She lied to me. She told you what you wanted to hear, so you'd help her murder an innocent child for money. And you believed her because it made your job easier. Blake stood and walked to the window overlooking the industrial wasteland. The sun was setting over Miami, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. In Chicago, Lily would be having dinner with her grandmother, safe and healthy and completely unaware that her mother had tried to kill her for an inheritance. Here's what's going to happen, Blake said without turning around. You're going to call Elena and Carmen and tell them there's an emergency. The FBI is closing in on the operation and they need to meet you here tonight to destroy evidence and plan an exit strategy. They'll never believe that. They'll believe it because they're scared. Because deep down, they always knew this day would come. People like you always think you're smarter than everyone else, but you're just psychopaths with college degrees. Blake turned back to face Troy. And after they arrive, we're going to have a group discussion about the 17 families you've destroyed, about the children you've orphaned and the women you've widowed. And then you're all going to disappear. You can't just murder 3 people. The police will. The police will find evidence that Troy Matheson and his associates fled the country after the FBI got too close to their operation. Bank records showing large cash withdrawals, airline tickets to non-extradition countries, emails indicating panic and hasty escape plans. Blake's smile was peaceful, almost serene. I've had 48 hours to arrange your disappearance, Troy. By the time anyone realizes you're not in the Cayman Islands, there won't be enough left of you to identify. Marcus appeared in the doorway. They're coming. Both vehicles, right on schedule. Blake checked his watch. 9:23 p.m. He'd given Elena and Carmen an hour to reach the warehouse after Troy's panicked phone call. They'd made good time, probably terrified that their carefully constructed operation was falling apart. Remember, Blake said to Troy, you want them calm when they arrive. No warning signals, no hints that anything is wrong. Just 3 criminals having a business meeting about escaping justice. The warehouse had been carefully prepared. Blake's security team had disabled the cell towers in the area, cutting off all communication. Surveillance cameras had been installed to record everything that happened, creating a comprehensive record of the conspirators' confessions. And the building itself had been wired with enough explosives to ensure that no forensic evidence would survive the final act. Elena Santos arrived first, driving a Mercedes SUV that probably cost more than most people made in 2 years. She was exactly what Blake had expected from Troy's description: elegant, well-educated, and completely immoral. She walked into the warehouse like she owned it, projecting the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences for her actions. Carmen Vasquez-Miller arrived 5 minutes later in a Tesla, looking nervous but determined. She was younger than Elena, less polished, probably the newest recruit to Troy's operation. Blake wondered how many murder conspiracies she'd need to participate in before she developed Elena's casual indifference to human life. What's the emergency? Elena demanded as soon as she saw Troy. Your call made it sound like the world was ending. We have a problem, Troy said, following Blake's script perfectly. A big one. Blake stepped out of the shadows behind the support beam where he'd been waiting. The problem is that you murdered the wrong man's daughter. Elena spun toward him, her hand moving instinctively toward her purse. Blake nodded to Marcus, who appeared behind Carmen with his pistol drawn. Ladies, Blake said pleasantly. I'm Blake Morrison. I believe you've been working with my wife. For the next 3 hours, Blake conducted the most thorough debriefing of his career. He wanted names, dates, methods, and financial records. He wanted to know about every victim, every scheme, every detail of the operation that had tried to destroy his family. Elena proved to be the most defiant, maintaining that they provided a service to unhappy women trapped in loveless marriages. Carmen broke down completely, sobbing confessions about murders she'd helped plan and families she'd helped destroy. Troy just sat in his chair and answered questions mechanically, his spirit broken by the reality of his situation. By midnight, Blake had a complete picture of the conspiracy. 17 murders, 14 successful inheritances, and 3 operations currently in progress targeting wealthy men in Boston, Denver, and Seattle. The organization had generated over $60 million in stolen inheritances over 4 years, with plans to expand internationally. You're sick, Elena spat when Blake finished his questions. We helped women escape abusive situations. We provided liberation for men who treated their wives like property. Blake's response was delivered in the same calm tone he'd used for business negotiations. You murdered 17 innocent people for money. You convinced their wives and daughters to become killers. And you tried to murder my 11-year-old daughter. He stood and walked to the table where Marcus had arranged the tools they'd brought from Chicago. Medical implements, construction equipment, and chemicals that would ensure the warehouse fire burned hot enough to eliminate all forensic evidence. But you made one critical error, Blake continued, selecting a bone saw from the collection. You assumed that Blake Morrison was just another wealthy victim. You didn't research your target carefully enough. Elena's defiance finally cracked. What do you want? Money? We can pay you. We can disappear and never bother your family again. I want justice for 17 families who never got it. I want everyone who knew about your operation to disappear permanently. And I want my daughter to grow up in a world where people like you don't exist. Blake's smile was gentle, almost paternal. Fortunately, I have the resources to arrange all of those things. The warehouse burned for 6 hours before the Miami Fire Department could bring it under control. The official investigation concluded that the blaze had been started by faulty electrical wiring in a building scheduled for demolition. No human remains were found, but investigators did discover evidence of a hastily abandoned operation involving document destruction and computer equipment disposal. Bank records showed that Troy Matheson, Elena Santos, and Carmen Vesquez-Miller had all made large cash withdrawals in the days before the fire. Security cameras at Miami International Airport recorded images of 3 individuals matching their descriptions boarding flights to the Cayman Islands on the night of the fire. The FBI task force investigating the Meridian Wellness Consulting murders concluded that the primary suspects had fled the country to avoid prosecution. Interpol issued warrants, but the trail went cold in the offshore banking havens of the Caribbean. Claire Morrison, sitting in her Chicago jail cell, never learned what had happened to her co-conspirators. Her attorney negotiated a plea agreement, life in prison without the possibility of parole in exchange for her cooperation in the federal investigation. She would spend the rest of her life wondering why Troy had never tried to contact her, never sent money for her legal defense, never attempted a rescue operation. Blake Morrison returned to Chicago and resumed his role as a devoted single father rebuilding his life after his wife's betrayal. He sold their Lake Forest mansion and moved with Lily to a secure penthouse downtown, where they started over with just each other. He never told anyone about his trip to Miami. He never spoke about the warehouse or the 3 people who'd screamed his daughter's name as the flames closed in around them. Some stories, Blake understood, were better left untold. Chapter 7. New Foundations. 6 months after the warehouse fire in Miami, Blake Morrison stood in his new penthouse kitchen, teaching his daughter how to make pancakes from scratch. Lily's laughter echoed off the granite countertops as she tried to flip one and watched it fold in half, creating what she declared was a pancake taco. "Daddy, you're much better at cooking than Mommy was," Lily said, attacking her creation with a fork. Blake felt the familiar stab of protective rage at the casual mention of Claire, but his voice remained steady. "Practice makes perfect, sweetheart. We'll both get better at taking care of each other." The penthouse was a fortress disguised as a home. Every window was bulletproof glass. Every entrance was monitored by military-grade security systems, and Blake had arranged for private tutoring, so Lily never had to leave the building without armed protection. She thought it was all because of what had happened with Mommy's sickness. She had no idea that Blake Morrison had made enemies who might someday try to use her as leverage. That afternoon, while Lily worked on her art project with Miss Peterson, her tutor, Blake met with Detective Rodriguez in his office downtown. The federal task force had officially closed the Meridian Wellness Consulting case, concluding that the primary suspects had successfully fled to countries without extradition treaties. "We've identified 12 more victims," Rodriguez said, spreading photos across Blake's conference table. All wealthy men, all with family members who inherited substantial estates after suspicious deaths. "The pattern goes back 6 years, not 4 like we originally thought." Blake studied the faces of the dead men, memorizing their features with the same attention he'd once paid to architectural blueprints. These were the people Troy Matheson and his partners had murdered before targeting his family. Their children and grandchildren would never know their killers had paid for their crimes. Any leads on the suspect's current location? Cold trail in the Caymans. Bank records show they moved money through shell corporations, but it all disappears into offshore accounts we can't access. For all practical purposes, Troy Matheson, Elena Santos, and Carmen Vesquez-Miller have vanished. Blake nodded gravely. "I hope they never surface again. Some people are too dangerous to be allowed back into civilized society." After Rodriguez left, Blake returned to his penthouse and spent the evening reviewing homework with Lily, reading her a chapter from their current book. and tucking her into bed with the routine they'd established since Claire's arrest. Normal father-daughter activities that felt strange after the violence and deception of the past year. But as Lily drifted off to sleep, Blake walked to his study and opened the secure laptop that contained his real work. The work Detective Rodriguez and the FBI task force would never see. The investigation into Meridian Wellness Consulting had revealed the existence of other organizations operating similar schemes. Blake had identified 3 separate networks in different parts of the country, all targeting wealthy families for systematic murder and inheritance theft. The authorities were pursuing them through legal channels, warrants, surveillance, prosecution. Blake Morrison was pursuing them through different means. The first network operated out of Boston, led by a former pharmaceutical executive named Kenneth Phillips, who recruited desperate housewives and taught them to poison their husbands with compounds that mimicked natural diseases. Blake's Boston associates had been tracking Phillips for 2 months, documenting his operation and identifying his clients. Phillips would disappear next month, along with his partner and their 3 most active customers. A gas explosion in their Beacon Hill headquarters would destroy all evidence of their activities, and their deaths would be ruled accidental by investigators who never thought to look for traces of the industrial accelerants Blake's team would use. The second network operated out of Denver, specializing in staged accidents rather than poisoning. Their leader, Dr. Sarah Manning, was a trauma surgeon who'd been quietly arranging medical emergencies for wealthy patients whose families wanted to inherit quickly. Blake's Denver team had infiltrated her operation by posing as potential clients, gathering evidence that would never see the inside of a courtroom. Dr. Manning and her associates would die in a skiing accident in Aspen, their bodies lost in an avalanche that Blake's Alpine specialists would trigger at precisely the right moment to ensure no forensic evidence survived. The third network was the most sophisticated, operating out of Los Angeles and targeting Hollywood celebrities and tech entrepreneurs. Blake's California associates were still mapping their structure, but the elimination would be spectacular enough to send a message to anyone else considering similar enterprises. Blake Morrison had decided that some crimes were too heinous for conventional justice. Some criminals were too dangerous to be allowed the possibility of escape, appeal, or eventual release. And some victims deserved a more thorough revenge than the legal system could provide. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Marcus Webb. Boston package ready for delivery. Green light when you are. Blake typed back. Execute tomorrow night. Clean and complete. Another message, this one from his Los Angeles team. Target structure mapped. Estimated timeline 6 weeks for full package. Blake responded, acceptable. Maintain surveillance and await final authorization. He closed the laptop and walked to Lily's room, standing in her doorway and watching her sleep. His daughter was safe, healthy, and completely unaware that her father was systematically eliminating everyone who operated businesses like the one that had tried to kill her. Blake Morrison had spent 6 months building a private network of elimination specialists, funded through offshore accounts, and operated with the same efficiency he'd once applied to construction projects. The organization had no name, no headquarters, no official structure. It existed solely to remove people who targeted innocent families for murder and theft. The authorities would never connect the accidents, disappearances, and mysterious deaths. Each elimination was perfectly staged, completely self-contained, and designed to look like the natural conclusion of dangerous criminal enterprises. But Blake knew that every death brought justice to families who'd lost fathers, husbands, and children to predators who thought wealth made them untouchable. As he prepared for bed, Blake reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning when Paul had called to tell him Lily was in the hospital. He discovered that his wife was a would-be murderer, that his family had been targeted by professional killers, and that conventional justice was inadequate for dealing with certain kinds of evil. But he'd also discovered that Blake Morrison was uniquely equipped to provide a different kind of justice, the kind that ensured certain problems never resurfaced. His phone rang at 11:47 p.m. Marcus Webb, calling from Boston. Package delivered successfully. Target and associates eliminated without complications. Scene staged as accidental gas explosion. First responders found no survivors. Understood. Return to base and begin preparation for the Denver operation. Blake hung up and walked to his study window, looking out over the Chicago skyline. Somewhere in the city, families were sleeping peacefully, unaware that people like Troy Matheson and Kenneth Phillips had ever existed, unaware that Blake Morrison had taken personal responsibility for ensuring they never would again. Tomorrow he would make breakfast for Lily, help her with her mathematics homework, and take her to see her Uncle Paul for another follow-up examination. He would be a devoted father, a successful businessman, and a pillar of Chicago's society. But tonight, he was something else entirely. Tonight, Blake Morrison was justice without mercy, protection without limitation, and revenge without end. And he was very, very good at it. Chapter 8, The Final Hunt. 1 year after Claire's arrest, Blake Morrison received an invitation that made his blood run cold. The envelope was addressed to B. Morrison in elegant calligraphy, with a return address from the Cayman Islands. Inside was a formal invitation to a memorial service for Troy Matheson, Elena Santos, and Carmen Vasquez Miller, to be held at a private resort in Nassau. The invitation was signed, "A Friend Who Remembers." Blake studied the card in his study while Lily practiced piano in the living room, her music floating through the penthouse like a soundtrack to his thoughts. Someone knew what had happened in Miami. Someone was drawing him out, using the anniversary of his revenge as bait for a trap. His secure phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Webb, received similar invitation. Analysis suggests high-end paper, professional printing, offshore postmark. No digital footprints in the delivery chain. Blake typed back, "Any ideas on the sender?" Negative. But this feels like professional intelligence work. Government or high-end private security. Blake walked to his window overlooking Lake Michigan. The invitation could be from law enforcement, trying to trick him into admitting his crimes. It could be from associates of Troy's organization, seeking revenge for their destroyed network. Or it could be from something worse, another criminal enterprise that had learned about Blake's private justice project. His phone rang. Dr. Paul Morrison, calling from Northwestern Memorial. "Blake, I just received a very strange package at the hospital. An invitation to some kind of memorial service, addressed to P. Morrison, brother of the Avenger. What the hell is this about?" Blake felt ice water in his veins. Whoever had sent the invitations knew about Paul's involvement in uncovering the poisoning. They knew about the family connection, about Blake's methods, about details that should have been impossible to discover. "Don't touch anything else in that package," Blake said. "I'm sending a team to collect it for analysis." "Blake, what kind of trouble are we in?" "The kind that requires immediate action. Can you take a leave of absence? Maybe visit that medical conference in Switzerland you mentioned. Are you telling me to leave the country?" Blake's voice was flat and cold. "I'm telling you that someone very dangerous is trying to draw our family into a confrontation. And I don't want you or Lily anywhere near Chicago when I deal with it." After hanging up, Blake called his travel coordinator and arranged for Paul to be on a flight to Geneva within 6 hours, under the cover of a medical emergency requiring international consultation. Then he called Lily's tutor. "Miss Peterson, I need you to take Lily to visit her grandmother in Highland Park immediately. Tell her it's a surprise, early vacation. Don't pack anything from the penthouse. Buy whatever she needs when you get there. Is everything all right, Mr. Morrison?" "Everything will be fine. Just keep her safe and away from the city until I call you." Blake spent the next hour making arrangements that he'd hoped never to use. Private security teams were activated, offshore accounts were accessed, and weapons were retrieved from hidden locations throughout the building. By evening, the penthouse was transformed from a family home into a fortress prepared for siege. Marcus Webb arrived at 8 p.m. with a team of 6 specialists, all veterans of military special operations who'd worked with Blake on previous elimination projects. They set up surveillance equipment, checked weapons, and established secure communication protocols. "Whoever sent those invitations knows about Miami," Marcus said. "They know about the warehouse, about Troy and his partners, about everything we did there." Theories. 3 possibilities. First, government intelligence figured out our involvement, and they're trying to build a case. Second, Troy's organization had hidden partners who survived our cleanup, and they want revenge. Third, someone completely new has been watching our operation and wants to either recruit us or eliminate us. Blake considered the options while reviewing building schematics on his tablet. The penthouse was defensible, but it was also a trap if the wrong people controlled the elevators and stairwells. Better to take the fight to them on ground of his choosing. "I'm going to Nassau," Blake announced. "That's exactly what they want. Then they'll get it. But not the way they expect." Blake's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would attend the memorial service, but not as himself. One of his security specialists would travel under Blake's identity, using carefully forged documents and enough physical resemblance to fool casual surveillance. Blake himself would arrive in Nassau 3 days early, using an alternate identity he'd maintained for situations exactly like this. The memorial service was scheduled for Saturday evening at an exclusive resort on Paradise Island. Blake arrived the previous Wednesday as Michael Brennan, a Canadian real estate investor interested in Bahamian property development. He checked into a different hotel, rented a car under his cover identity, and began conducting surveillance on the memorial venue. The resort was impressive: private beach, luxury accommodations, and the kind of security that suggested very wealthy or very dangerous guests. Blake spent 2 days photographing the grounds, identifying entry and exit points, and documenting the staff and security arrangements. On Friday evening, he spotted a familiar face checking into the resort. Ashley Kim, the widow of tech entrepreneur David Chun and one of Troy Matheson's previous victims. According to the FBI case files, Ashley had inherited $18 million after her husband's suspicious death, then disappeared when the federal investigation began. But Ashley Kim was supposed to be dead. Blake had personally arranged for her elimination 6 months ago, after his Los Angeles team had tracked her to a plastic surgery clinic in Brazil. Her death had been reported as a botched medical procedure, another casualty of the criminal network Blake was systematically destroying. Except she was here, alive and walking into the resort where someone had arranged a memorial service for the people Blake had killed. Blake returned to his hotel room and activated his secure communication system. "Marcus, we have a problem. Ashley Kim is alive and at the target location." "Impossible. I saw the death certificate myself. Either our Los Angeles team was compromised, or someone staged her death and has been using her as bait ever since. Either way, this is bigger than we thought." Blake spent Friday night reviewing every detail of his global elimination network. If Ashley Kim had been extracted before his team could eliminate her, it meant someone had been watching his operations from the beginning. Someone with resources and intelligence capabilities that matched his own. Saturday evening arrived with a tropical sunset that painted Nassau's harbor in shades of gold and crimson. Blake positioned himself on a hillside overlooking the resort, equipped with sniper's scope and communications gear that allowed him to monitor the memorial service from a safe distance. The guests began arriving at 7 p.m. Blake recognized several faces from his target files: family members of murdered victims, law enforcement officials who'd worked the Meridian Wellness case, and people he couldn't identify but who moved with the professional confidence of intelligence operatives. At 7:30 p.m., his doppelganger arrived in a rented Mercedes, playing the role of Blake Morrison attending a mysterious memorial service. Blake watched through his scope as the man was escorted into the resort by security personnel who seemed more interested in protecting him than arresting him. At 8 p.m., a woman emerged from the resort's main building and walked to a podium overlooking the beach. Blake adjusted his scope and felt his world tilt sideways. Claire Morrison stood at the podium, very much alive and apparently free from the Chicago jail, where she was supposed to be serving a life sentence. His wife began to speak, her voice carrying across the water through speakers hidden in the landscaping. "Thank you all for coming to remember Troy, Elena, and Carmen. They died because they tried to help me escape from a monster who masqueraded as a loving husband." Blake's finger found the trigger of his rifle as Claire continued her speech. "Blake Morrison is a killer. He murdered my friends, he threatened our daughter, and he convinced the world that I was the real criminal. But tonight, we're going to show everyone who Blake Morrison really is." The trap was perfect. Blake's double was surrounded by witnesses, recording equipment, and law enforcement officers who believed they were documenting his confession to multiple murders. Claire's escape from prison, Ashley Kim's staged death, the memorial invitation, all of it designed to lure Blake Morrison into a situation where his guilt would be undeniable. But Blake Morrison hadn't built his empire by walking into other people's traps. He activated the first of several explosive devices he'd planted around the resort during his reconnaissance. The blast destroyed the resort's power grid, plunging the memorial service into darkness and chaos. Emergency lighting activated automatically, but Blake had anticipated that too. His second device eliminated the backup power systems. In the confusion that followed, Blake Morrison became a ghost moving through the darkness. Night vision equipment gave him advantage over security personnel who were stumbling around with flashlights. Suppressed weapons eliminated targets without alerting their associates. Blake's double was extracted during the chaos, spirited away by Marcus Webb's team, while the real Blake Morrison hunted the people who'd tried to destroy him. He found Ashley Kim first, hiding in a resort bathroom, while security teams searched for the source of the explosions. Blake's knife was quick and quiet, and Ashley Kim's second death would be much more convincing than her first. Claire was more difficult to locate, protected by what appeared to be federal agents who were trying to evacuate her from the compromised venue. But Blake had advantages they couldn't anticipate: detailed knowledge of the resort's layout and explosive devices placed in strategic locations to channel their movement. The third blast collapsed the main building's eastern wing, forcing Claire's protective detail toward the beach, where Blake was waiting with a rifle and unlimited patience. His wife died with his name on her lips, calling him a monster as his bullet found her heart. The federal agents died too, their bodies adding to the casualty count of what would be reported as a terrorist attack on American citizens vacationing in the Bahamas. Blake Morrison slipped away from Paradise Island, while Bahamian authorities were still trying to understand what had happened. His escape route had been planned months in advance: speedboat to a private airfield, charter flight to a carefully prepared safe house, then commercial flights under multiple identities that would eventually return him to Chicago. The official investigation concluded that the Paradise Island attack had been carried out by unknown terrorists who targeted American law enforcement personnel investigating international financial crimes. The death toll included Claire Morrison, the estranged wife of a Chicago businessman, along with several federal agents and resort guests who'd been caught in the crossfire. Blake Morrison was questioned as a potential target of the attack, since his wife had been among the victims. He expressed shock and grief at Claire's death, wondered aloud why she'd been in the Bahamas instead of prison, and provided alibis that placed him in Chicago during the entire incident. The FBI found no evidence linking Blake to the attack. His phone records showed he'd been conducting business meetings in Chicago. Security cameras placed him at his office building during the time of the explosions. His private jet had never left O'Hare Airport. Blake Morrison was officially cleared of any involvement in his wife's death, making him a widower and single father who'd lost his family to criminal conspiracies and terrorist violence. 2 weeks after the Paradise Island incident, Blake sat in his penthouse kitchen making breakfast for Lily, who'd returned from her surprise vacation with her grandmother. She chattered about her week in Highland Park while Blake listened and planned his next moves. The elimination network that had tried to trap him was destroyed, but Blake knew there would be others. Criminal organizations that targeted wealthy families, intelligence agencies that tried to manipulate his operations, anyone who thought Blake Morrison could be used or controlled. They would all learn the same lesson Claire had learned, the same lesson Troy Matheson and his partners had learned. Some people couldn't be victimized. Some people fought back with resources and ruthlessness that their enemies couldn't match. And some people never stopped hunting until everyone who'd threatened their family was dead. Blake Morrison was all three, and he was very good at it. Chapter 9: Empire of Ashes. 3 years had passed since Paradise Island, and Blake Morrison's empire had grown beyond anything he'd originally envisioned. What had started as a personal quest for justice had evolved into something far more ambitious: a global network that eliminated criminal organizations before they could harm innocent families. Lily, now 14, attended an exclusive private school in Chicago while living in the penthouse that had become their fortress. She was intelligent, athletic, and completely unaware that her father had become one of the most feared names in certain criminal circles. To her, Blake Morrison was simply a successful businessman who sometimes traveled for work and always made sure she was protected. Blake's legitimate businesses continued to prosper, providing the perfect cover for his real work. Morrison Development had expanded internationally, with projects in 12 countries that gave Blake access to resources and personnel he could never have acquired through traditional channels. His corporate empire was worth over $2 billion, generating enough legitimate income to fund unlimited black operations. But it was the illegitimate empire that occupied most of Blake's attention. His network had eliminated 47 criminal organizations in the past 3 years, dismantling operations that ranged from inheritance fraud to human trafficking to political assassination. The methods varied. Some groups disappeared in apparent accidents. Others were destroyed by internal warfare that Blake's agents carefully orchestrated, and a few were eliminated in spectacular incidents that sent messages to anyone considering similar enterprises. Blake's organization had no name, no official structure, and no permanent headquarters. It existed as a collection of independent cells, each specialized for specific types of elimination. The operators never met each other, communicated only through encrypted channels, and knew Blake only as the architect, the invisible designer of campaigns that destroyed his enemies with mathematical precision. On a Thursday morning in October, Blake sat in his office reviewing reports from his European division. A human trafficking network based in Amsterdam had been eliminated the previous week through a coordinated attack that left no survivors and no evidence. The local authorities had concluded that the group's warehouse fire was the result of faulty electrical wiring, never suspecting that Blake's specialists had spent 2 months planning the operation. His secure phone buzzed with an incoming message from Marcus Webb, who now served as Blake's operational commander and the only person who knew the full scope of the organization. Priority target identified. Chicago location. Personal relevance high. Blake's blood went cold. Any threat in Chicago was a threat to Lily, and threats to his daughter required immediate and overwhelming response. He activated the secure communication system and called Marcus directly. "What's the situation? Remember Detective Rodriguez? The one who worked the Meridian Wellness case." Blake remembered Carmen Rodriguez clearly, competent, dedicated, and close enough to uncovering the truth about Blake's involvement that she'd required careful management during the investigation. What about her? She's been conducting an unauthorized investigation into the Paradise Island incident. Apparently never believed the terrorist attack theory. She's connected it to several other elimination operations, including the Boston and Denver networks we destroyed. Blake felt the familiar cold calculation settling over him. Detective Rodriguez had been useful during the Meridian Wellness investigation, but usefulness had limits. And anyone who got too close to exposing Blake's organization became a liability that had to be addressed. How much does she know? Too much. She's identified patterns in the deaths, financial connections between the victims, and she's been building a profile of what she calls the cleaner. Someone who eliminates criminal networks through carefully staged accidents and disappearances. Blake's mind was already working through the implications. Rodriguez wasn't just a curious detective anymore. She was a threat to everything he'd built. Her investigation could expose the organization, endanger his operators, and potentially lead authorities to his door. Where is she now? Chicago PD headquarters, working late on her unofficial investigation. She's been staying in the building until midnight most nights, using computer systems to cross-reference cases from multiple jurisdictions. Blake checked his watch. 8:30 p.m. Lily was at home, working on her homework under the supervision of her tutor and bodyguard. The penthouse security system was fully active. His daughter was safe. "I'll handle this personally," Blake said. "Blake, this is a Chicago police detective. If she disappears, there will be a massive investigation. She won't disappear. She'll have an accident. Something tragic but completely believable. The kind of thing that happens to dedicated officers who work too many late nights and drive home when they're exhausted." Blake had learned during his years of eliminating criminal networks that the best operations were the simplest ones. Complicated schemes created evidence and witnesses. Simple accidents left only grieving colleagues and closed case files. Detective Rodriguez's accident would be a traffic collision. Her car would lose control on Lakeshore Drive during her late-night drive home, cross the median, and strike a concrete barrier at high speed. The investigation would conclude that she'd fallen asleep at the wheel after working 18-hour days on a difficult case. Blake's automotive specialists had perfected the technique during previous operations. A small device attached to the vehicle's steering system, activated by remote control, would cause sudden loss of directional control. The device would be destroyed in the resulting fire, leaving no forensic evidence of tampering. Blake left his office and drove to Chicago PD headquarters, parking across the street with a clear view of the detective division parking garage. Rodriguez's car was in its usual spot, a 5-year-old Honda Civic that suggested a dedicated public servant who spent her salary on practical necessities rather than luxury items. Installing the device took Blake 12 minutes. He'd practiced the procedure dozens of times on similar vehicles, and Detective Rodriguez's Honda was exactly the kind of car his specialists had trained on. The device was invisible once installed, virtually undetectable even during a thorough mechanical inspection. Blake returned to his car and waited. Rodriguez emerged from the building at 11:47 p.m., walking with the tired gait of someone who'd spent too many hours staring at case files and computer screens. She looked exactly like what she was, a good police officer trying to solve crimes that nobody else cared about. Blake felt no satisfaction as he watched her drive toward Lakeshore Drive. Detective Rodriguez was collateral damage, nothing more. She'd chosen to investigate things that were none of her business, and now she would face the consequences of that choice. The device activated automatically when Rodriguez's car reached the predetermined location, a stretch of Lake Shore Drive known for traffic accidents, where a late-night collision would be completely believable. Blake monitored police radio frequencies as emergency responders were dispatched to the scene of a single-vehicle fatality. Detective Carmen Rodriguez died instantly when her car struck the concrete barrier at 70 miles per hour. The accident investigation concluded that she'd fallen asleep at the wheel after working excessive overtime on several difficult cases. Her colleagues mourned a dedicated officer who'd given her life to the job she loved. Blake Morrison attended Detective Rodriguez's funeral 3 days later, expressing condolences to her family and speaking with police officials about the tragedy of losing such a dedicated investigator. He donated $50,000 to a scholarship fund in her memory, establishing himself as a concerned citizen who appreciated the sacrifices made by law enforcement. Her unauthorized investigation died with her. The case files were archived, the computer searches were attributed to her dedication to cold cases, and her theories about the cleaner were dismissed as the speculation of an overworked detective who'd been connecting dots that didn't exist. Blake returned to his penthouse that evening and found Lily practicing piano, her music filling the space with beauty that seemed impossible after what he'd done. She looked up and smiled as he entered the room. "Daddy, I learned a new piece today. Do you want to hear it?" Blake sat beside her on the piano bench and listened to his daughter play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, her small hands moving across the keys with grace and precision. The music was perfect, innocent, completely untainted by the violence that funded their life together. "That was beautiful, sweetheart. Miss Peterson says I have real talent. She thinks I could be a concert pianist if I wanted to." Blake kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and feeling the weight of everything he'd done to protect this moment. "You can be anything you want to be, Lily. Anything at all." As his daughter returned to her music, Blake walked to his study and opened the secure laptop that contained his real work. Messages were waiting from operatives in 7 countries, reporting successful elimination operations and requesting authorization for new targets. Blake Morrison had built an empire on the ashes of his enemies, funded by legitimate business success and maintained through the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened innocent families. His organization had become a shadow government, dispensing justice in situations where conventional law enforcement was inadequate or corrupted. He'd lost his wife to her own betrayal, discovered that love could be a weapon used against him, and learned that trust was a luxury he could never again afford. But he'd gained something more valuable than any relationship: the absolute certainty that his daughter would grow up in a world where people like Troy Matheson and Claire Morrison couldn't hurt her. Blake Morrison had become exactly what his enemies had accused him of being: a monster who destroyed anyone who threatened his family. But he was their monster, and he was very good at being what they needed him to be. As he reviewed operational reports and planned future eliminations, Blake listened to Lily's piano music floating through the penthouse. She was playing Mozart now, something light and cheerful that reminded him why he'd built this empire of ashes in the first place. Some fathers built businesses to leave to their children. Some fathers built wealth to ensure their children's security. Blake Morrison had built something different, a machine of perfect vengeance that would continue operating long after he was gone, ensuring that no one would ever again mistake his family for victims. His phone buzzed with a final message of the evening, this one from his Swiss banking division. Quarterly operational funding transferred. Total assets under management now exceed $12 billion. Blake smiled and closed the laptop. Tomorrow he would take Lily to school, attend a board meeting for Morrison Development, and have lunch with potential investors for his latest real estate project. He would be a normal father and businessman, contributing to his community and raising his daughter with love and care. But tonight, Blake Morrison was the invisible architect of justice, the shadow that fell across criminal organizations worldwide, the name that made evil men wake up screaming. And he was exactly where he wanted to be,